Hi there, welcome back. We're going to be talking next about the visualization sciences and cognitive biases. So, specifically, we're going to start by talking about data visualization traditionally versus the shift that we're seeing to the visualization sciences, which takes into account things like psychophysics and just the perceptual reactions that people have to different kinds of visualizations. So, traditionally this was treated, very much like a sciencey art, and now we're starting to see some more real physical sciences come into the space to complement that. We still need the art, right? This is not a diss on that in any respect, but it is a shift in the field that people in learning analytics should know about and should probably follow along. We're also going to talk about cognitive biases, and then we're going to have a very short example where we think about what's actionable and reasonable in the dashboard before we move on to a longer dashboard example later. Now, if you're looking to get a handle on what's going on in dashboard research more generally, we'll talk a little about that in these videos, but there's some great review articles out there over the last few years, some of them as recent as 2021, some of them a little bit older, but they're going to go through, what are the trends in the kinds of theoretical backgrounds and whatnot that we're looking at in dashboards. There's less work on the trends and visualizations. There's a notable exception that we've covered in this video, but for the most part, this is a space that we should be paying more attention to. Traditionally, there were, some giants in the field of data visualization, and Edward Tufte is absolutely one of them. Stephen Few and Steve Wexler both are as well. But Cole Nosbaum Knaflic is a Google scholar, not the search engine, but Google employee who is a scholar who is, um, making some really great points in the field about the kinds of things that we should be paying attention to. We're going to look at her slide on pre-attentive attributes here in just a minute. I will also point you to other references, including, back to our reference page or our additional resources page, and that'll include some other famous books on dashboard visualization and that you might want to just be familiar with. That will include a few more books that you might just want to be familiar with, because if you're going out trying to get a data visualization job, people might ask you about these people, and it's good to know about them, even if you don't need to know necessarily every specific thing in every book. They're also great places to look for ideas for visualizations, with caveats coming up, right? That the more complicated your visualizations are, the more sophisticated your audience has to be in terms of their data literacy, and that may not necessarily be your goal. Now, Tufte has a very famous list of data visualization principles that include proportionality. You basically, if you use one proportion for one set of numbers, make sure you're using the same proportion for the other set of numbers so that people can actually make comparisons. When there's ambiguity, particularly, but even when there's not, you want to use clear labels. The goal basically is to show data variation, not design variation. Now, there are a few other things that we might also want to consider. He suggests that we use standardized units for monetary measurements. Again, this is a very business-focused field in many cases. Standardized units, I think, are a good goal to have across any domain, and particularly learning measures and time measures. We want to make sure that we're using standardized units so that people are comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges. Um, he also recommends that, the number information carrying variable, basically the number of dimensions in the graph should not exceed the number of dimensions in the data. And, the short version of this is, keep it simple, right? The more you're asking people to just, dig through mountains and mountains of data, the less they're going to actually understand the story you're trying to tell with it. And there's nothing worse than a giant spaghetti mess of lines with 30 or 40 lines in it, um, that people can't figure out which one they're supposed to pay attention to. And then finally, he says graphics should not quote data out of context. We need to make sure that there is a story there for people to hold on to, and that we're giving them a complete and honest story of what the data is. One of the things that comes out of these principles that's very often quoted is called the data ink ratio. And it is an important thing to pay attention to. It is also something that, as research on perception has increased, um, we need to be paying attention to accessibility issues, right? So if you're looking at sort of the strict data ink ratio, what it says is we should use the minimum amount of ink to communicate the information in the data. And that might include even getting rid of all of these um, numbers here in the y-axis in most extreme interpretations of this, right? If all you need people to understand is here with example B that student 17 is significantly lower than the class average, then you probably don't need these numbers. However, that's not always our goal in learning analytics, right? We actually want people to have a little more anchoring and a little more information in here. So, if you were going to go with a pure data ink ratio, like I said, this example B would be the one with, the highest data to ink ratio. But it turns out that we probably want a little more anchoring. And definitely in terms of accessibility, people who struggle with dyscalculia, which is, basically they describe it as the math equivalent of dyslexia, but it essentially means that there's some spatial reasoning issues that make other kinds of mathematics difficult as well. So when you have people have those kinds of backgrounds or who have other kinds of visual impairments or anything else, having these extra lines and making it easier to determine exactly whether or not this person is right at 60 or just above it, how far in between they are. This anchoring really, really helps. And if there's something like a passing grade that you want to highlight, having additional anchoring is important as well. Uh, in order to draw attention for things like that, Nussbaumer Knaflic, who we saw just a second ago, recommends paying attention to what we call pre-attentive attributes. And she's certainly not the only person to talk about it, but this graph here, visualization here, is from her work. So she reminds us that we can use orientation. So we have the same shape, right? But we change the orientation as a pre-attentive attribute. We can change the shape, we can change the line length or the width, we can change the size, the curvature, we can add marks, we can use an enclosure. And then in terms of color, we could use either hue or intensity. So we have this light gray here. We can use spatial position and we can use motion. Uh, these things are all important to pay attention to. We're going to take just a quick second and talk specifically about some new and emerging research in the field because it turns out most human perception seems to be logarithmic. So that means that we're going to notice, small differences and big differences in different ways, right? And this cuts across various parts of the human perceptual system. So we see neurological response rates that are different for auditory perception, for luminosity in vision, for numerical conditions, so things like distance or magnitude, for perception of heaviness when you're lifting things. All of this is logarithmic. You're gonna tune out some small differences. You're gonna pay much more attention to the bigger differences, bigger than the actual measurement would suggest. Right now, emerging research that shows that this does not always hold for autistics. And so for autistic people, we want to be aware of that. There may be instances where there could be additional sensory overload caused by this sort of thing, where even the small differences are perceived in a larger way than non-autistic people would perceive them. Um, and again, like I said, this is an emerging research, and it does um, hold across large parts of the visualization system. It does get influenced by other factors as well. And we're going to just give you a quick example of this. And again, I think this is going to flash a lot of information at you very quickly. But Franconi et al. looked at different graphs. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 here. Different graphs. So we've got a scatter plot, a parallel coordinates plot, a stacked area, stacked line, stacked bar, donut, radar, line, and ordered line. And what you're seeing across this left-hand side of the screen is when we have a correlation of uh, -1, right? So a perfect negative correlation moved across this range to a perfect positive correlation of +1, and the R values in between are -0.8, -0.3, +0.3, and +0.8. So these are the equivalents down this column in all of these different kinds of line charts. And then what we're seeing on the right is a study of what's called just noticeable differences. So this is when 50% of the people notice a difference. And what we see is that for positive and negative correlations, the response rate is a little bit different, right? There were a couple other things that they were looking at. One was whether or not you were giving somebody um, a bigger difference and then to go into a smaller difference, or vice versa, and that also induces some variation in how people react to just noticeable differences. What how small the just noticeable difference is affected by all of those variables, not just the logarithmic pattern. So again, don't try to squint through these. But on the left here, we have these negative correlations, one with a really strong correlation, one with a weaker correlation, and one with something in the middle. And on the right, it's the same thing, right? We have a weak correlation, a strong positive correlation, and a correlation in the middle of the two. Over here, we have a positive scatter plots, just noticeable difference, and you can see that those are smaller, though not by a lot, than the negative correlations over here. And we'll look at it as well for the parallel coordinates plot. And you can see a bigger difference between the positive, which is in the left square here, and the negative correlations. The just noticeable differences are easier for the negative correlations over here than they are for the positive correlations over there. So that research is all out there for you guys to explore. When you are exploring your own data, those scatter plots really are hard to beat. If you're looking at two variables, these, scatter plots here are going to tell you pretty quickly if you've got a strong correlation or if you have a lot of noise. And, it could be a strong correlation that's negative or positive. Um, but for a lot of you, I'm sure this is not news, but it's hard to beat that when you're just trying to go through and figure out what your data is. If you are a relatively data savvy person, this is very intuitive. And again, I said I think I'm preaching to the choir. The box plots are also really good for this because it allows you to see not just the average, but the standard deviations, which can help you to make some decisions. Histograms are always good before you do much else because you need to know how normal your data is. And if you're looking at particularly time series, it's hard to beat a line chart. Um, now, uh, if you're trying to pick charts for somebody else, you're going to see that there are a lot of tools out there that are willing to help you do that depending on what kind of data that you've got. Right. So if you're trying to present a distribution or visualize composition or show relationship, these sources that are out there are going to give you different kinds of advice. They're going to give you some advice, as you will see here, that includes things like pie charts and stacked bar charts that are a little bit difficult for people to process. And so you're going to need to use some judgment with that and maybe fool around with the different kinds of tools that are available out there. Again, the additional resources page has a lot of them that you can, toy with to see if you get better advice than others. I'm going to walk you through a couple of really bad visualizations to explain, why the pie chart is just preferred, even though it's a really popular tool. And I'm going to start with an extreme case. This is causes of Google employee ER visits, and it very helpfully has the actual percentages in here because you can imagine if it did not, that you would have a very difficult time telling that the blobfish was at 1%, and so was the beaver and the dog and the house cat and the Sasquatch. You can definitely see that there are, you know, some of these that are slightly bigger than others. That the rounding errors are happening here. Um, and basically the rule of thumb is if you have a single population that you're trying to give the distribution of, a pie chart can be okay. It's best if the sections are hitting on these 90-degree angles, and this one is not, right? So this one is at a 24%. So we know that the most likely reason a Google employee would go to an emergency room would be for bears, tigers, or honey badgers pretty quickly, but making comparisons across any of these others is going to be difficult. Now, definitely, we see this emerge in other parts of people's lives. It is very difficult to convince people that one large pizza is going to give them more area than two small pizzas because we just don't handle the area of circles as well as we handle the area of other kinds of shapes. Those with 90-degree angles are really preferable. Now, this is because when we're doing circles, we're asking people to make multiple comparisons, right? So definitely with a pie chart, we're asking people to look at the shaded area, but we're also asking them to look at arch length, which would be that outer edge on this circle or this outer edge on the wedge that we've pulled out of the circle. And then we're also asking them to look at the angle, and we are not good at any of those, or at least there are other things that we are much better at. Angles appear to be particularly difficult for us. So if you look at the two of these, you might think that these are basically the same size. Maybe not, particularly if you're looking at the circles, they're not really lined up, in quite the same way, which should, if your perceptual system behaves like a vast majority of people, make it a little more difficult to make this comparison. And even when we get them closer, it might be a little more difficult to tell. We would basically need to have them overlapping before we could see whether or not, for sure they were the same size. And, if not, which one was bigger or smaller. Other things that can be really tricky in visualizations include 3 dimensions. In many cases, it's going to actually hide your data. So we've lost most of the row of lemons back here is just a mystery. We don't know if it's just lower than, the other fruits or if it is indeed at 0 back there in the February and March columns. You'll also maybe be able to pay attention to the fact that this line here is significantly longer than this line here because that's how you make a 3-dimensional shape look 3-dimensional. But it does add a layer of distortion, particularly if you weren't using categorical variables here, that could really distort your data. And then a third bad visualization that we have here is the stacked bar chart. And again, this is a fairly extreme example, but what you'll see here is that, the variable that is probably most noticeable is this blue one across the top, right? Because these kind of even blend together in some of these color palettes. But we don't have a common starting or stopping point for these. So you would really need to actually take a shape and go across and make sure that they were all the same length in order to know whether or not this was the same. Um, if it were the same, it's possible that we would be better off making sure that it was at the bottom. But in general, just having people make that many comparisons at one time is probably not a great idea unless they are incredibly visually literate, and many people, even when they are going to struggle with that. So what should we do instead, right? We should be paying attention to the visualization science research, particularly the research about how we process pre-attentive attributes, um, and uh, looking at accessibility, including color blindness, but also these other sensory processing differences that are emerging. We should make sure that we have unitization there. And then the last thing we're going to want to make sure we do is pay attention to the cognitive biases that affect our data interpretation. But I'm going to start with some of these visualization instructions and move on to those cognitive biases in just a second. So, double encoding is a way to improve accessibility, right? So, if you have normal vision, this column on the left uh, is going to be what you see. If you have color blindness of one sort or another, and there are multiple kinds here, they're not all represented in this chart, then you're going to see this thing here on the right. If both of these look the same and you did not know you were colorblind, congratulations, you've just learned something new about yourself from this demonstration. I imagine at this age that you guys are already aware of that. Um, but to drive this home, I'll just remind you all, if you're looking at rates of color blindness, it's higher for men than it is for women across nationalities. In the United States, it is 1 in 12 men, right? So that means in a classroom of 30 people, we might expect to have 3 students who are colorblind, right? If we balance for gender, right? Pretty easily, we can expect to have at least 2. So double encoding could be done with color. It could be done with uh, color and shape. So we have the diamonds and the circles. It could be done with color, shape, and intensity, right? So not just, you know, nominal colors, but the intensity of color. In general, what we see with these pre-attentive attributes, um, we're going to look at several of these here where they've been tested. Um, position with distance is going to be the most noticeable difference. Length is going to follow closely. Area follows that. Angle is lower, as I said before. And then the intensity is typically lower than that in terms of our ability to respond quickly. Now, this list is also from Franconi's list of suggestions. And in general, one of the ones that he considers to be most important is the distortion of an axis. So we want to make sure here that if we are making a deliberate distortion, that we are very clearly marking that y-axis to show that this is not a 0 in the space, right? It's totally fair to do that if we need to show an actual difference that people can perceive, but we need to make sure that it's very, very clearly marked, right? For stacked bars, right, he says bars on baseline are position coded. So uh, there is the same difference between the black and the gray bars, but only the difference in the black bars is really perceptible because of the position here in these stacked bar charts. Um, and then here we're looking at something that looks like a 1:7 area ratio, but the length here is what we're seeing, and um, the area that we're seeing is actually a 1 to 2.5 ratio. Right? So your brain is processing 2 different pieces of information, and it's given priority to the length instead of to the area. And then here we have intensity values, and we can see that this gray dot here and this gray dot here look very different, even though they are actually the same color. But when we frame them in a darker or a lighter environment, it causes them to look like they're of different intensities. Okay. So, um, you know, looking at a dot plot versus looking at a stack bar or a bubble map or a slope, these are all going to give us very different reactions. And we want to choose the ones that are most powerful, which would be those here at the top. Again, this is why it's hard to beat something like a scatter plot rather than the things that are lower towards the bottom. Other recommendations he gives you, like if you're trying to get somebody to make comparisons across pairs, right? And you ask them to say, hey, okay, which one of these pairs has a higher value first and then a lower value. So you can imagine you would really want to know if somebody was coming in with a really high pretest and then at the final exam scoring very low. That would be really important information. Since we have trouble making those comparisons across those pairs, what he suggests is that we stick with this or we convert this to a delta difference and that we do above and below the line so people can very quickly see that. We can also double encode it by changing the intensity of the graph. Another option is to go through and add the colorization on that original lollipop chart. This is going to perform slightly better than this one, right? And so on. But definitely pay attention to what these pre-attentive attributes are, and look through the literature on this sort of thing. Now, even if we have really good visualizations, as I said, people tend to have fairly low data literacy generally. And that means that we're going to have a lot of cognitive biases that are affecting things. We've talked about the base rate fallacy without calling it the base rate fallacy when we looked at the OBGYN's interpretation of cancer testing results. But here is a very clear example. If you ask somebody what this person's profession is likely to be after you've told them that the person is shy, you say, hey, this is my friend Steve. He's really shy. Is he a salesperson or a librarian? Most people are going to say, oh, he's a librarian. But in fact, the number of shy salespeople in the population outnumbers the number of librarians. And so you are better off guessing salesperson than you are librarian. And this is just not intuitive, even for people with relatively good data literacy. Other biases we'd like to pay attention to in the education area in particular is the halo effect and its complementary bias, the horn effect. So the short version of that would be the students who give me those good evaluations are just really, really good looking, right? The two features are actually probably not related. You probably won't get better looking by giving me a better valuation. But people are going to impose a good quality on somebody if they already have a good quality associated with them, and vice versa in many, many, many cases. Another bias we want to be careful of that we've talked about a little bit, but it extends beyond sort of visualization is the anchoring bias. And so if we just give you information about two different students, student 17 and student 21, we'll look at this information and say, hey, student 21 did really well compared to student 17. So that first piece of information that you give somebody really shades how they interpret that. We might not even notice that they are above that passing rate of 70% that we expect in a lot of US classrooms. So if we want them to pay attention to that, we want to add an anchor, right? And if we want them to pay attention to a different value, like the fact that they are both well under the class average, then we should present that average as well. The next bias that we're going to talk about real quickly is the streetlight bias. So basically, the cartoon here shows somebody who says, well, uh, I lost a quarter. And the police officer says, oh, did you drop it here? And the guy says, no, I dropped it a couple blocks down the street. Well, why are you looking at here? Well, this is where the street light is. This happens a lot in educational data mining and learning analytics. We have a lot of variables that are really difficult to measure. And so we either ignore them, which is unfortunate, or we measure something that's sort of close to them. And then we, you know, move forward without necessarily adjusting the labels accordingly. Um, without really exploring what other things might be there. Now, there are a couple consequences to this. One is that we may misinterpret our data. The other one is that we start giving things like points and merit badges out or otherwise displaying them in the graph. And if you give a merit badge for the percentage of correct answers, and you give a different group a merit badge uh, for the number of problems that they've attempted, you're going to get very different behavior. So wherever we're shining the street light, that's what people are going to pay attention to. That's what we're going to be paying attention to, and we need to be really, really cautious about this and how we present this data so that people, including ourselves, interpret it correctly. Right? And then finally, we're going to talk about big and small number biases. So, what we know is that even extra geeky math nerds struggle with long decimal points. If you ask them to put these for in ascending and or descending order, they're going to struggle with it. We have a left-hand bias in all numbers, and if you don't believe me, you can ask your local sales team why that, you know, car is on sale for $29,999 instead of $30,000. It's because we really psychologically adjust differently to that left-hand column, whatever it might be in any given number, right? So there's good evidence in general, right, that humans start to struggle when the numbers get out of sort of their first base space in their number system. Now, English is currently a base 10 language, but not all languages are, and historically English wasn't. That's why 12 is a dozen in English. It's why 11 and 12 are different from 13 through 19. It's because we used to be a base 12 language. There are base fours, there are base fives, there are base 37s that involve counting up and down people's arms and across the face and back down the arm with all the digits. But when people are in those spaces where they can count on their hands and they can count on their toes, they do a lot better than they do with bigger numbers. So, if you talk about a million and a billion, people don't have a good sense of how different those numbers are. You may have seen this memed on the internet, but a million seconds is 11 days, right? A billion seconds is 12,000 days almost 30 years. Mm. So, again, this happens even with people who are relatively well trained. So, if you look at disease reporting, we've seen a lot of examples of that in the news in the last few years. Um, Professionals are going to report on the number of people dead or infected per 100,000. This allows us to standardize across localities the way that a percentage would without having to use a decimal place, which, is still going to have that left-hand bias and affect how people order greater than larger numbers, even when they're well trained in it. It's also a little more interpretable, right? So if there are 10 people infected per 100,000, that means that you probably won't know anybody who's sick. But when we start to hit 1,000, which feels like a bigger number, um, it means that possibly you might, right? It's going to get larger and larger. You're going to, you're going to be able to interpret the difference between 10 and 1,000 better than you are between zero point zero 0.01 and 0.0001, right? Um, and then again, like I said, it also just makes it easier to handle any potential errors. So, what data viz principles should we follow? When I went through with my class, we came up with a list the first year that I taught this class, and the data ink ratio was right at the top with the need for redundancy for accessibility purposes, and with the need for redundancy for focusing attention on insights, right? Both the use of text and color can be applied here. For color, right, avoid red, green contrasts and other non-accessible combinations. Use white for missing data is another suggestion that was, thrown out by the class. And then to test all of your visualizations for color blindness is just really good standard practice at this point. In terms of labeling, we want to make sure that we're intentionally using the 0 on the axis or very clearly labeling it. Otherwise, In learning analytics, we also have an additional consideration. We want to use positive labels so that we're able to set goals. So if you come in and say, hey, look, this kid's bored all the time, you know, people are going to really latch onto that label, and it's not going to be very easy to come and say, hey, stop being bored. Right? Or we need to make this kid not bored. But if you say, hey, you know, this kid is not finding this information very interesting, a goal to make things more interesting might be more feasible than to make it more boring, at least in some cases. Right? If large amounts of additional text are needed, then a table or a heat map might actually be better in some cases. But in general, the goals here are fair representations of number. Big and small numbers need contextualizations. People aren't great at interpreting values from angles and arches. We need to know that and pay attention to the lines versus area interpretation. And then finally, we need to pay attention to uncertainty and how it's represented. So if our model only performs at 60%, that can be really good in terms of automation with a low risk intervention, right? So if everybody benefits from a little extra practice, then if we're wrong, it doesn't matter. But if we're going to do something like say, hey, this kid doesn't get opportunities, we need a model that performs a lot better. Um, and we need to make sure that that kind of uncertainty is communicated to the audience that's making those decisions.